just want to say before we dive in, I'm so happy to be here. It's always so wonderful to be back home. It gives me so much joy and pleasure to just like power walk across campus, like just in the good old days. And to be sitting here with a woman that I've been looking up to for many years. I remember coming across her badassness when I was a first-year student here, and we over time developed a relationship. She's become a dear friend and mentor of mine, and this is a true dream come true for me. So thank you for sharing the stage with me, Sanyin.
If you can't tell, we can't stop smiling, because like for me, I've been here for the last 20 years, and so to see all of you come home, welcome home, and to see Thamina and just, gosh, all the great things that you have done and continue to do. And I'm just so happy to be here with you too. I mean, find people who feed your soul. This is one of them. Oh gosh, yes, hi. Stephanie, it's good seeing you too.
Love that. I think there's so much power in participating in and engaging in conversations around the shared lived experiences of womanhood. And that's why I just love coming back for Women's Weekend specifically, because we all know Duke women are just awesome. And let's dive in. So I have the honor of kicking us off today. And before we're going to talk about personal branding, I wanted to take a step back and talk about what a brand is, because I think when we think about consumer brands, it's a little bit easier for us to conceptualize. So let's talk about the most valuable brand in the world, Apple. When I purchase an Apple product, Apple is making 3 promises to me. 1, I get a beautiful piece of hardware. 2, that piece of hardware doesn't require an instruction manual in order for me to operate it. And 3, I get access to Apple's prestige. And part of that access allows me to unlock, a world of infinite opportunities when you see the world just a little bit differently. That's the essence of the Think Different philosophy, right? So a brand at its core is a promise to its customers. And it's very similar for personal brands. A personal brand is a promise to the people around you about how you show up each and every day within the context and the spaces that you operate in. And here's the spoiler. Every single person, everyone in this room, if you like it or not, you all already have a personal brand, but the big difference is some people don't necessarily have control over their own personal brands, and they allow their environments to make that personal brand, create that on their behalf without their explicit input. And look, we all know it's easy for people to be put into a box and for people to make quick judgment calls. And I think that is a massively missed opportunity, especially for women, and here's why. We live in a world that is structured against us. Every single day, we fight against misogyny, discrimination, gaslighting, macroaggression, similar to what Professor Washington pointed out earlier. I call it macroaggressions because there's nothing small about them. And that impact is even more significant for women whose identities intersect with other marginalized social dimensions, such as race, religion, ability, sexual orientation, immigration status, socioeconomic status, and so on. So, in other words, The world around us is already dictating so much about our real lived experiences. The people around us, including other women, by the way, are already biased before any of us even opens her mouth. So why would any woman want to pass on an opportunity when so much about her intersectional identity is already subject to the various different gender role expectations that society has of her? So, building a personal brand is really, really an opportunity for all of us as women to reclaim our own narrative.
Tamina, I love what you just said, because what I heard in there is, one, a brand is how are you perceived, right? And do you have control over how you're perceived? Now, here's the reality. How we're perceived can differ vastly from which room we're in. So some rooms I walk in, and what they see is, oh, short little Asian woman must be a pushover, right? Without even me saying a single word. Another room I walk in, they're like, oh, you're Sophie, Charlotte, and Oliver's mom. And they see me as mom. Another room I walk in, they see me as a speaker and a thought leader. The thing is, how do we understand how we're perceived? And then the other thing I heard is about promises. What are our promises to the world? And when I think about the promises and how we're perceived, to understand how we're perceived and to control that narrative, we have to have intention around how do we want to be perceived, right? How do we want to perceive? What do we want our narrative to be? Otherwise, how can we have control over that? And the second thing on the promises, I'll just be honest with you. When people tell me, oh, what's your brand? Come up with your personal brand. I have no freaking clue. It's just like, and I remember one time sitting down to write a bio, and you all know there's nothing harder. We can write our bio. We can write our friends' bios for them. Like I can devote the next 60 minutes just to talking about Tamina and how amazing she is. That's easy. But when it comes time to write our own bios, oh, hard, right? And so I remember a few years ago, I was sitting down to write a board bio. And what came out in my head instead were, Sanyin loved being a mom, a great friend, and those whom she loved never have to guess how much she loved them. She wasn't always brave, but she made others braver because she believed in them. And I like that better. I wish that's actually my obituary that I was writing in my head, right? Except let's not be so morbid. Let's just call it our end game statement. Because every strategy starts with a great end game. And what's more end game than how we are perceived at the end of our lives? What stories will they tell about us? Are they going to say, when we think about the people we love, like Janet Hill, I'm going to start crying. Okay. There's Janet Hill. She's no longer with us, but her legacy lives on. Now, when I talk about Janet, I talk about how she made me feel, how she believed in people. Now, her list of accolades, we can write a book about her list of accolades, right? And so sometimes I think we conflate brand with the awards and the achievement. When I was trying to think about brand, I don't know how to think about that. I'm sorry, here I am on a panel about building your brand, and I'm like, I don't know how to think about that. Well, I do know how to think about it. I don't know how to answer what's my brand. But here's an exercise that can help you figure out more how you want to show up in the world, as Tamina said. And that's this. Think about one or two things that you love about yourself. You may be an amazing friend. It just came from the Penn Pavilion where Candace was talking, and Candace talked about her friendships. I'm like, oh, you know what? Candace must be an amazing friend, right? It might be your empathy. It might be your gift for words. But whatever that thing, those things that you love about yourself, think about your brand as, these are things you love about yourself, and now here's your gift to the world. Those are the things you love about yourself you're going to give to the world. And that can be the start. Think through that exercise. Actually, I gave you 2 exercises. One is think about your end game statement. At the end of your days, what do you want your friends, your family, those who you have come across in life to say about you? And that will start giving you a sense of who do you choose to become, right? And then the other exercise is, what do you love about you? And write those down, because that is your gift. And that also is part of your brand. That's a lot easier than saying, write a biography, write a brand statement. My take on it.
I love that, Sanyin, and I would like to spend a couple more minutes talking about that, because so much of your work is revolving around enabling that greatness in other people, right? And helping them find their, what you call superpowers. And I know that that topic really lights you up, so would love for you to maybe spend a couple more minutes talking about a person's superpowers and how they can leverage their superpowers in order to have that become part of their brand.
The origin story of the superpowers work is it's actually this entire conversation. I would go into rooms and I would look in awe. I'm like, oh wow, there's Tamina, and she's a podcast host, and she's so amazing. And oh my gosh, there's Stephanie, who's like got this brilliant financial analyst brain, and she helps so many people. And it's so easy to see what everyone else offers. And I struggled with trying to understand, well, what am I even doing here? Everyone else is so amazing. What do I have to offer? Have you guys ever felt that way? Or maybe I'm the weirdo, someone, right? And I realized, but here's the thing. We all have worth, and we all have value, and we need new ways of seeing each other and seeing ourselves. And I thought, if I have this problem, other people might have it too. So how do we go about discovering the things that are differentiatingly great about us? Because the reality is, what's extraordinary about you to the rest of us, it's just your everyday normal. So we can reflect all we want about what our superpowers are. And we can't come up with the answer because that's a blind spot. That's what blind spots are. You know what? How do you discover your superpowers? Friends, look around you. You're back here. Start with your Duke community, your friends, your family. They can easily tell you if you just ask, but we don't have that comfort level of asking, you know? And so that's the beauty of it. To discover our superpower, go and find friends who will tell you the honest truth. And I would bet it takes more courage to ask someone what makes you differentiatingly good than it does to say, hey, what can I do better? We're high achievers. We're all over the feedback loop, the critical feedback loop. So, but Tamina, you enable greatness all the time in others. I mean, think about just even at Duke, the way you mentor. I mean, that's what I find so compelling about you. That to you never think, wow, I'll wait until I get to this level and then I'll start giving back. You were, as a freshman, for as long as I've known you, you have never been about you. You have always been about, gosh, how do I help others be their best selves? In this case, through investing and financial literacy. So how do you think about your brand, and how do you think about your gifts and what you want to share with the world?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for those kind words. It means a lot coming from you. There's so many different ways of approaching this question, but being in sales, let me give a sales analogy here. So this is more of a commercial answer to your question, and I'll get more into the moral and philosophical answer in a moment. But people in sales, people like me, what we care about is generating revenue. And in order to generate revenue, you're dependent on sales leads. And there's two different types of sales leads. There is outbound leads and there is inbound leads. And an outbound sales rep, what they do, they proactively hunt for net new business. You know, they do cold outreaches over the phone, over email. In fact, I did that for a year as a sales development rep at LinkedIn. It was probably the toughest job I've ever had. You get a lot of no's. So anyone who has their own business, who has to do outreach like you know what I'm talking about. So that's outbound. Inbound, on the other hand, is a little bit more comfortable sometimes because potential new customers and revenue, they come to you. Usually when the marketing department has done a good job marketing your services and your products, right? So the way I look at building a brand or, you know, using your superpowers to make a living from that is really you are able to create your own inbound sales channel by building a personal brand. And what it comes down to is really visibility in the market, right? You can be the world's greatest executive coach. You can sell the most beautiful shoes, right? But you're not going to get your money's worth if nobody knows about you, nobody knows who you are, right? But it's not just about money. I think when you build your personal brand or you spend your time on things that are in complete alignment with your values and your unique gifts, that is so powerful because it's a form of self-expression and it's incredibly rewarding. Does that answer your question?
It's a beautiful analogy, and I'm learning from you. I'm like, oh, inbound, outbound sales, that's a beautiful analogy. So let's play with that a little bit more. So I would imagine you can have visibility out there, right? And that's important. And by the way, for those, you might be wondering, gosh, I hate to self-promote. Self-promotion is scary. Yeah, I agree. And so here's my way around it. Get your friends to promote you. Yeah, that's community, right? Like all throughout this, you're seeing Tamina and I, we're promoting each other. That is so much easier for us to champion each other. So we don't have to champion ourselves, but we do have to know, as you beautifully put it, how do you want to express yourself? What are the promises, going back to the apple analogy, that you want to give to the world? So on the inbound and outbound, inbound is so much easier because once you're known, then the customer acquisition cost, is so much lower on an inbound than if you're trying to go out there on an outbound. However, not every inbound. So for those of you who are small business owners or who have been in sales, not every inbound is actually something you want to say yes to.
Not a sales qualified lead.
Oh, thank you for that. I'm learning lots today. Not a sales qualified lead. And so here's another way of thinking about it, because what we want in life, I mean, there's achievement, but achievement, is dissociated from happiness. Right? Because like you say you win the Oscars. What's next year? Can I win another Oscar? Oh, maybe I go for the EGOT, right? And so it's like this. EGOT stands for Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, and Tony. It's like the wow of the entertainment industry. But happiness and fulfillment is a little bit different. And what we hope for you in our Duke family here is a life of success as defined by fulfillment, and you define that success, right? So I'm going to go back to this idea of the inbound. Not every inbound is a sales qualified lead. And so when you're thinking about that, who's your stakeholder? Who do you want to engage with? And on a more personal level, A dear friend is Allison Levine, who's another Dookie, another Duke sister, who is the first female captain to climb, the captain of the first female U.S. female team to climb Everest. And Allison speaks all over the world. That's what her main role is, keynote speaker. And one time she and I were talking, and she said, isn't it funny? We get on a plane for the love of strangers. So when it comes to that inbound, start with the people who love you already. There's like zero acquisition cost there. They love you already. It's very easy to take that for granted and just chase after the things that we don't think we have, the love of strangers, right? So that's just my 2 cents on that.
No, absolutely. And I think, when the default thinking when you talk about a brand is always like external visibility, external, but it starts with internal. Like I wouldn't be sitting here and I wouldn't be working for LinkedIn in New York City if I hadn't built a strong internal personal brand at my company. I'm the youngest person in my entire organization who isn't a US citizen that they transferred over to the New York office from Dublin. I needed visa sponsorship and I was very junior at the time. And I'm the first and youngest person to have achieved that, but only because I was able to build a very strong personal brand internally amongst people that I trusted, my team members, my manager, my senior manager, eventually the head of my organization once I started, building my network and was afforded airtime with these leaders after having proven myself, won a couple of awards, was very strategic about wanting to win those awards, literally walked into a one-on-one with my manager, was like, look, Sandra, I think this quarter would be a good time for me to win the organization-wide leadership award. Let's just make that happen for myself, okay? And she was like, yeah, because obviously it made her look great as well. If one of the people that she manages and mentors and coaches wins this regional award, that's a very good look for her as well. So I think to your point, surround yourself with the right type of people that can help you get there. And yes, sometimes it is about collecting those accolades, especially the beginning of your career, right? But eventually it's that path toward living your most authentic life and being in complete alignment with your values. And I think that's just the most beautiful place to be in.
So let's riff off of that a little bit. So your brand, you're probably wondering, we haven't defined brand. We talked about why it's important to build your brand, how perhaps you might start discovering what your personal brand is, but we haven't really defined couch in terms, what is brand, right? So we heard about what your promise to the world, that's one aspect of it. What you just said is your values. What are your values? How you be isn't just what you do, it's how you be. What are the values that are important to you? And then, of course, your superpowers, your differentiating strengths. It has to be context dependent, right? And here's what I mean by that. So as long as I've known you, you have been a lifelong learner, right? And by the way, Duke lifelong learning, forever Duke, right? We're all deeply curious, so lifelong learning. And it's we're adding different layers to ourselves. So I would push us not to think so much about brand as your values, yes, that's concrete and the thread, but the application doesn't have to be forever. Think about it in phases. So you were podcast host, that was part of your brand. And then the next phase, you're like, oh, I'm curious. I still believe there's a book in you, or several books in you.
Oh, it's coming at some point. It has to, for sure.
So we're going to layer on author, best-selling author on top of that, because the Duke fam will be lifting you up on that one. And convener of, teacher, convener with FenHive. For me, when I started, at Duke, I was an engineer, then policy, and then the Coach K Center. but then every 3 years they take on learning something new. And so you're adding layers. So the expression of your values and your gifts doesn't have to be limited by one singular application throughout your entire life, but rather as lifelong learners, wouldn't it be wonderful to just keep layering and layering? And by the way, on superpowers, you may have latent yet to be expressed superpowers in which the situation for their expression just hasn't occurred yet, right? And so what new uncomfortable spaces might you be entering into that can be leading to the discovery of that superpower and the enabling of yet another application of your brand?
I love that, because when I heard you speak, Sanyin, what immediately came to mind for me is like the topic of reinventing yourself, pivoting, right? And I'm 28, and for me, trying to figure out who I was, the role I wanted to play in this world, that was something I was really, really, really struggling with after graduating from Duke. I fell into this deep hole, was suffering from what I refer to as post-graduation depression. That was the premise of my first podcast, actually, because up until that point in my life, I had always been a student for the vast majority of my life. I always knew that, after first grade comes second grade. After high school comes college, if you're so fortunate to be able to attend college, right? So you have all of these like predefined milestones. But once you graduate from school, and there is not like graduate school or professional school coming right after, you kind of have to start making those milestones, create them for yourself, right? And there's nobody who's guiding through that process. So I was really struggling with reestablishing a new sense of identity that was not tied to being a student anymore. And it's taken me a couple of years to get to this point where I'm now like, okay, my purpose in life is I am a cheerleader and hype woman for other women. That's literally what I want to do with my life. If someone can pay me to do that, that's literally all I want to do with my life. Now, I haven't necessarily figured out the details yet. I know it's probably going to be somewhere around, women's financial health, what I've been working on over the past year and a half or so. But that is me completely reinventing myself after having been a student for around 16 years of my life, right? And you have worn and continue to wear so many different hats, and would just love to learn how you give yourself the permission to pivot and to also recognize hey, at this stage of my life, it's maybe time to let go of that previous part of my identity in order to make room for something else. I'm sure there's women in this room, for example, who maybe took a short break because they became mothers, right? That's usually a very, very pivotal chapter in a woman's life. And how do you get back out there? So much has changed about not only your body, but your psyche. Maybe you dealt with postpartum depression. Maybe you're suffering from birthing trauma. There's so many things that we unfortunately don't talk about as much. It's not as much part of the public discourse. Part of my work around, fertility preservation, which is a whole separate topic, but, is increasing awareness. But yeah, just curious to hear from you. How do you know when it's time to pivot or time to evolve and tap into maybe a new set of superpowers?
I'm not so strategic. You're making an assumption I'm far more strategic than I actually am. I want to double emphasize one of the things you said there. We have to share data with each other. We don't talk about money and with each other. Stephanie's nodding. She's one of the great financial advisors here. We don't talk about relationships. So we think that there's a term called pluralistic ignorance, in which we think the problems we're facing are unique to ourselves. If we talk and we share data, We might figure out other best practices, and it's normalizing these problems in such a way that we can find solutions out of it. And that's the power of community, right? Power of community to learn from each other, to share, to connect, to bolster each other up. I love what you said about you discovered a purpose that gave you joy capital. That's so important. But in terms of how do I figure out when to evolve, I don't think about necessarily, I don't think about it as in 2 years or 3 years, it's time to make this pivot or change. It's more, I think about layers, right? Okay, so let me back up. Since we're talking about finance and business talk here, we have to talk about the idea of risk. So when we make changes, a lot of times we are probably thinking about risk. Wow, there's such high risk in that. Great decision makers change the risk profile by affecting other factors associated with, to be able to minimize that risk. What I mean by that is, I think about a portfolio career. So it's not just one thing, but we're layering. And by the way, we're living in a time in our history that enables that. You are winning awards at LinkedIn in terms of the client relations and sales. And you're also a podcast host. And you will be a best-selling author. And, and so it's not leaving always the lessons we carry with us. We're layering. And when I think about that, I think about portfolio career. Because a portfolio career is our way of mitigating emotional risk. So I could have a really bad day as an executive director of the Coach K Center, but then a really awesome day with my kids as a mom. By the way, that's also a big part. I'm a mom first. And so so think about a portfolio, and when you're evolving, see what opportunities come your way. So by the time you evolve, you're not going from 0 to 100, you're starting at 50. So I'll tell you about my new evolution. It's as an investor. So I've been advising startups in 2019, and I thought, gosh, wouldn't it be nice advising? And I'm getting equity, and I thought, I'm putting time rather than money. I'm making an investment, and wouldn't it be nice to know what are the right types of, how do I up the probability of those bets being good bets? So start reaching out to Lori Cashman and other amazing investors in our Duke network and say, how do you look at this? And by the way, I'm interested. Now you just visible, you said make it visible. I'm interested in investing. So my friend Paxton said, I'm pulling together a group for the DC Spirit. That's a women's national soccer team and small group. And are you interested? Because I think you're interested. You have mentioned you wanted to be an investor in a sports group. I'm like, yes, but it's got to be atomic investor, like this much, because I do work for a nonprofit after all. And through that, I was able to be an investor in the DC Spirit. So whatever your next evolution is, see the opportunities come your way, and most likely you're not starting at 0. You're starting at 50. And then you just have to let people know. Like, we already know she's going to be writing a book. You're not starting at 0. You've already got all that knowledge to put on paper because you've been doing it with FenHive and your podcast. You're not starting at 0 in terms of being a book author. You're actually starting at 75. So the risk is now significantly lower. So that's a way at least that's how I think about it. How about you? I mean, you made so many evolutions.
Yeah, I think it's funny that you're mentioning the investment piece, because that's something that has become very relevant to me very recently, actually. And let me tell you a story there. We all know at this point, I want to be paid to be a hype woman for other women, okay? So that's my spiel. And ideally, I make myself rich by making other women rich. That would be the ideal job title or job description. Becoming rich by making other women rich. Perfect, okay? How do I get there? Well, I care about money because I think money is a tool to unlock access for women specifically, okay? I'm also very passionate about women's health, femtech, and women's reproductive rights. I'm passionate about this because I myself suffer from a chronic illness called lipedema, which is almost exclusively unique to women. I've had 3 surgeries up to this point, so I really, really care about this. Am I special? Absolutely not. There's millions of women out there who suffer from a chronic illness. I'm also not a medical professional, but what sets me apart from a lot of the other people out there is I talk about it, okay? And let me give you another example within like the women's health space. I had my eggs frozen last fall, like went through my first round of egg freezing. And at age 28, I found out that my fertility has already declined. It might be more difficult for me to conceive naturally. That's not necessarily something that you expect to hear someone in her 20s, right? So emotional roller coaster for me. But instead of like sitting there and like self-pitying myself, what I decided to do is to break the stigma and start talking about it. I started talking about it on Instagram. I started documenting my egg freezing journey on my Instagram story. I put a very vulnerable post out there on LinkedIn that went semi-viral, and what happened afterwards was pretty astonishing. I received a gazillion messages from women all over the world thanking me for my transparency and telling me that after hearing my story, many of these women, by the way, also in their like mid-late 20s and early 30s, they're saying, hey, I've been thinking about this for such a long time, but after hearing your story, I actually just booked a consultation with a fertility doctor next week. That, to me, like that in and of itself was already incredibly rewarding, because if me speaking up is leading to just one woman being in a place where she can make more educated decisions about her own body, then it was totally worth it, me putting myself out there. But it didn't just stop there. A couple days later, the CMO of a renowned nationwide fertility clinic reached out to me, wanting to get on a call with me. We chatted, wonderful conversation. She asked if I was interested in a paid collaboration in the future. I said, yes, sure, let's keep talking. She then also introduced me to her fertility clinic's head of fertility preservation, who happens to be one of the world's leading and most accoladed fertility doctors, whom I then got to interview for my new podcast. A couple of weeks later, I got connected to 2 co-founders of the startup called Blooming Eve, and their mission is to make egg freezing more accessible. 2 calls later, I'm now an official advisor to the company, and last week I just signed papers for my very first angel investment in that very same company at age 28. And so now, within a very short period of time, within like 3.5 months, like first egg freezing cycle in October, to becoming an advisor and angel investor in a company that has like 1,000% alignment with my values, got me a lot closer to that medium to long-term goal of wanting to become more active in the venture capital and angel investing space. And none of that would have happened if I hadn't put myself out there and created and held space for us to have these conversations and provide women with access to resources surrounding topics that are unfortunately still stigmatized, under-researched, and underfunded.
All right, so I'm like, thank you for your bravery in sharing that, because being vulnerable in that way it takes extraordinary courage. And if we link it back to promises and gifts, I'll say, and purpose, your purpose is to enable other women to be even more successful, right? And your gift to the world is this unflinching vulnerability and being able to share gritty truth. No matter the things that you share may be hard are so hard for so many others, but you share it because you're driven by this purpose. Like, maybe if I share this, I can help another person. And that's how it continues. And it goes back to also your value of your integrity, right? And your generosity. So in that story, you saw the connection of promise, purpose, and values. Well, all right, so we started this with this idea of it's how we are perceived. And in leadership, it's like what we put out there, we can sit here and talk like this all day long, but it's also, what's more important is we already know what we think. It's more interesting to know what you think. And we're curious to see, what did you hear? What's a takeaway? And what questions might you have? We're not above code calling.
And we do have microphones going around the room, so if you just wait for your mic to get to you, so you can ask a question.
Meredith, up here.
Right here. Thank you, Erica.
Thank you both for such an incredible conversation so far. I've learned so much and really, really appreciate everything that's been shared. I'm sure many of us have had the experience of being in a scenario, whether it is at work or at school or with friends or with family, where we feel like our internal brand or perception of ourselves does not align with the way we are being perceived. And I'm curious what each of you think of like how you handle those situations and navigate either aligning or something else.
Do you want to start?
It really resonates with me because I feel like whenever with my parents or my grandma has no idea what I do, you know, like I could try to explain to her what LinkedIn does or what a podcast is or, you know, or even like egg freezing probably at this point. She just wouldn't like get that. She knows that I'm like working on important things and she's proud of me, right? But she doesn't necessarily like understand, you know, what it is. And I think, you know, family is so important, serves its purpose, but family doesn't have to fulfill every single need that you might have, just like a partner doesn't have to fulfill every single need that you might have. Give you an example. I love nature. My partner hates nature. Like he would prefer to sit at home all day long. And instead of like putting that pressure onto our relationship, like, okay, instead I'm gonna take Kate and we're gonna go on a hike, the Inu River, because I know she loves nature as much as I do, right? So, the different spaces that you operate in, they serve a specific purpose, but they don't necessarily have to fulfill every single purpose. And when you feel like it's not the most authentic environment for you to talk about, let's say, like your law practice or, you know, like cases that you work on in support of women, you don't feel like that's the right space to operate in, that's totally fine. But like when you're in this room, for example, this is the exact like right context for you to show up in that very authentic way and be inspired and be cheered on by your fellow Duke women. So that's how I think about it. Because if I was like spending too much time and energy like complaining about, you know, the fact that my family doesn't necessarily like understand where I spend my time every single day, that would be a lot of like wasted time and energy, I think.
So I'm going to build on that and take it from the family realm to what if those whom we work with may not see us as how we intend to be seen. And actually, that is whether you are starting off in your career or you're a CEO or a board director, I can promise you from what I've seen, that is one of the closing the gap between our intentions and people's interpretation of our intentions is the through line in every single leadership and career challenge, right? So one, I would have a question, which is, interesting. Is that our assumption? Say your boss and you're thinking, gosh, I am X, Y, and Z, but I don't think my boss thinks I am that. One is how much of it is just the internal voice in our heads, right? And two, how much of it is actually our boss thinking that. So we fall into the assumption trap a lot. In the absence of data, we can just spiral. I do that quite a bit. I can be looking at the reactions here and like, oh, everyone's so stony-faced. Oh my gosh, I must really suck right now in this, right? That happens, so go get data. So that's why asking for feedback is one of the most valuable things. And feedback is just data at this point in time. It doesn't define you. It's just data at this point in time. So let's go back to the example of your boss. Hypothetically, I'm just making.
She's her own boss, by the way.
To say, oh, come on, witty. That's another layer. Okay. So say, all right, say your boss said, oh, you did a great job. Say, okay, what about it made it great? Get to the behaviors, right? Or, I'll give you an example. I had a 360 done on me years ago. And the 360, for those of you who may not know what it is basically getting feedback, a formalized feedback on your peers, from your boss, from your direct reports. That's why it's a 360. And one of the things I prize myself on is my ability to listen. And I defined listening as being able to retain information that I heard for a very long time. I had 2 peers rate me and on listening, and 0 to 6, it came back a 4 with a standard deviation of 2. So my mind kicks in like, holy smokes, someone gave me a 2, another person gave me a 6. And I knew who gave me a 2. So I went to that person, I'm like, oh, thank you for taking the time to give feedback. Someone gave me a low score on listening, and can you help me understand? He's like, oh, it was me, Sanyin, I gave you a 2. Okay, I can recount our last 5 conversations. And so what can I be doing better on listening? And his response was, well, I know you can remember conversations, but I gave you a 2 because a lot of times I just want to vent and you're jumping in with solutions. Like, oh, interesting, the dynamic, right? So now I know how to shift my behavior if I want the perception of listening. Now I go to the person who gave me a 6 and I said, by the way, why did you give me a 6? She's like, Sanyin, she's British. She's like, Sanyin, because every time I come to you, you always have solutions. Completely different interpretations of the same action. But you just, from there, you have to get those data points. And then you have to think about what are the things, behaviors connected with that can shift to that perception, and then modify, because that's the adapting to that particular person. Or maybe just talking it out. But don't make assumptions. We all fall into the trap of making assumptions. Go get data.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Feinglass, 2011 alumna. I've spent my career in public service until recently, so my background is government, public sector stuff. And I would say my brand was always helping people and helping other people. I took a pretty hard pivot in my career and just started a small business this year that I'm hoping to grow really big. We can talk more about that later. I'm struggling with the idea of building a personal brand because it almost feels selfish to me in my public sector mindset. My brand was always externally focused, and now it needs to be about me and my business, and that I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that tension and that feeling of a brand maybe being selfish.
I can.
Go ahead. I have thoughts, but you go first.
All right. Do you believe that when you started this business, do you believe that your business can help more people?
Yes, I do.
So do you believe your business can help more people if more people know about it?
Intellectually, yes. Yes, of course.
Okay. Do you want to help more people?
I sure do. Ooh, this feels like a
so
great, like one-on-one.
So it's
Thank you.
about
Keep going.
So focus on that. It's not about you.
Yeah.
It's about what you want to do with it. And sales is finding a solution. It's matching up the solution you have to solving someone's problems in a really effective way. That's helping people, right? So the more people who know about what your message is, the more people you can help. So focus on that message. And by the way, you don't have to be the one broadcasting that message. You've got a community, an army of people who can help you do that.
And to add to that, like, never forget, people want to do business with people, right? And putting yourself out there, even though it might seem scary at first, it's a muscle that you can train over time. And you'll notice that the more you put yourself out there, the more connection there will be between you and your potential customers. And there is another sentence that I absolutely love, and I'm stealing this from Google's I'm Remarkable workshop. Always remind yourself that it's not bragging if it's based on facts. Okay? If you're actually helping people, and if you have helped, let's say, 100 people, that's a fact. That is not bragging. That's still supposed to be on your website and your outreaches and whatnot, but it's not bragging. And if you need help with coming up with promotional material, to Sanyin's point earlier, like, tap into your networks, ask your best friends that know you really well, that are somewhat familiar with your work, to write up something about you, and you'd be surprised by like how powerful that message can be.
And by the way, this idea about it's not bragging, if it's fact, I needed to hear that today, so thank you for that.
Welcome.
I would bet, even though you didn't mention it, if you're struggling with, and you're coming from public service, I'm going to bet another struggle you might have, just guessing here, is actually charging for your, we won't go into that because this is about brand for now, but there's plenty of amazing women. That's why go and get data. Okay, you're like, this is something I would love. I would do it for free. I have done it for close to free in government public service. Go get data on what are others in similar businesses charging. And that would give you a little bit of the courage, because then it's not about emotion. This is just a benchmark. Okay.
Here in the front or back there.
Oh, hi. Can you talk a little bit about the role of social media and brand building? So I am, I guess, no longer a junior attorney. I'm an attorney. I work for a big law firm, and everything that I put on the internet, basically, like, I try to run it by our communications department. But it sounds like Tamina and a lot of the other people here, they really leverage social media. So I guess, like, is it necessary for you to have a social media presence to effectively build your brand? And how to navigate that?
Well, you have about 1 million more followers than I do, so I'm going to let you answer that question.
I don't know how to replicate that 1 million followers, because I didn't set out to build 1 million followers. I think, again, it goes back, I mean, one of the questions I would get asked is, how did I build up 1 million followers? And the thing is, I don't do algorithms. How it started was, there's a longer story about how I became a LinkedIn influencer, and it was serendipity and the Duke relationships that made it happen. And when I became an influencer, I remember saying to my husband, oh my gosh, I'm looking at my friends here, and this was about 7 years ago, and 100,000 followers was a lot 7 years ago. Like, my friend here has 100,000 followers, this person here, I don't even know how to Twitter. And then I got really terrified. And Chad said to me, Sanyin, if you can help 5 people think differently in a better way, would that be success? I said, yeah. And he said, okay, don't focus as much on the followers, number of followers, focus on what you're putting out there, and what makes you different that can be put out there. So they gave us all influencers then the ability to do video. It was 30 seconds back then. And it was supposed to be, they give us a question, and then we're supposed to like come up with something, a wise response. And I thought, okay, I'm not very wise, but I happen to be around a lot of wise people, so why don't we just flip the camera over? And now I'm starting these 1-minute interviews. It was 30 seconds then, so really practice how to do a 30-second interview. And somehow that caught on. And it wasn't how the platform intended for it to be used. And so when they made video available to everyone, I remember Jeff Weiner, who was the CEO of LinkedIn at that time, highlighted this use as one of the potentials, right? So I go back to, do we need to be on social media to build a brand? Who do you want to know about you, right? Start with that. It's a tactic. What's the outcome you want? Who do you want to know about you? If you're looking at high-profile potential corporate clients, they're not, chances are, those are, as Tamina said, people want to do business with human beings. So the way to actually work with those prospective clients is actually to engage with them face to face, right? Social media, that's one part of it, but it's not fully necessary. What's the outcome you want to drive at? Work backwards, and where does this pull? You don't serve the platform, let the platform serve you. That's my answer.
I definitely agree with that. I think you really need to first take a step back and reflect on, okay, what do I want to get out of that? Is it like, do you want to stay within the current role? Do you then even have to change anything? Maybe, maybe not. Is your medium to long-term goal that you want to break out of the corporate world, become your own boss, start your own practice, you know? If that was the case, then building a social media presence is probably a wise decision to make, because you will have your network, but you will start to operate in a completely different context that people don't know about just yet. So you really need to tap into all the tools that you can get and have access to. And social media is just a very, very powerful tool. Also depends, okay, what's your audience? You know, like my audience is a global audience, right? Like I cannot talk to my family and friends and, you know, my peers from Ireland or from Germany, where I've lived before, right? So social media allows me to stay connected and still like share advice and share content with them. But if your vicinity is like very local or regional, you might not have to show up online, right? Then it's more about the in-person engagements, maybe more like being a speaker at events, right? Going to trade shows, going to conferences within your industry. You can still build a strong personal brand offline. It's just social media these days can just serve as an amplifier. And going back to what I was mentioning earlier about building, you know, that inbound sales channel, like that's what social media is just great for, because it's easier for you to be discovered online, and for people, even for, you know, like conference hosts or, you know, organization that might want to invite you as a speaker locally, but if they don't know where to find you because you don't have a presence online, it's going to be difficult.
And we've been talking about social media as one blanket term. Different platforms, people go to different platforms for different reasons. So think about the outcome you want and choose the platform. So LinkedIn, careers for keynotes and so forth. You'll hardly see me post career stuff on Facebook. I use that to capture my family's memories. And that's what a lot of people go to Facebook for, right? And Instagram and TikTok, I mean, all of these have their own particular purposes. And so not all social media platforms, it's not all the same. It's which one for whatever purpose and outcome you choose to have too.
Yeah, and on that note, I would say if you're considering building a social media presence, start with one channel, building an audience on one channel is already really, really hard, especially these days, you know. But two, if you don't do that full time or if you don't have any help, that's really, really, really tough. So really focus on getting to know one platform, the intricacies, what type of content goes well, try to follow people that are operating in a similar space, try to learn from them, replicate their success by tapping into your own unique superpowers, but like adopting some of the tactics and approaches that they're using.
Jenny, how are you doing on time?
5 minutes.
Okay, there was another question here in the front.
Go over there.
Thank you so much for your insights. My question is around rebuilding a brand and personal at that after you've messed up. So have you had a personal experience, for example, where you did something and you knew that it was pretty bad? How did you come out of that, and what lessons can you share?
So my biggest failure happened when I was at Duke. Now, luckily, there wasn't stuff on social media. Social media didn't exist back then. So the failure was I came in Duke. I was an AB Duke scholar. I thought, college is going to be a breeze, and it wasn't. And by my junior year, I lost my scholarship. And when my entire identity had been smart as defined by grades, and suddenly there's this terrible GPA, and my dreams of being a doctor and obliterated. That was one of the worst things that ever happened to me. It was also one of the best things, because it enabled me to rethink who am I? What are my identities? So the rebuilding part is scary, especially coming after a major failure. It can also, and I don't say this lightly because it is so hard, and I'm still feeling, that was 20 some years ago, and I still feel, the force of it a little bit. It's also an opportunity to really rethink. And the world is a lot less forgiving today because of social media than it was back then. So I don't know if you're talking about a social media mistake. That I don't know how to answer. But if you're talking about you messed up and you're trying to make amends, and it's with people around you, rebuilding trust is doable, but it starts with conversation, and it starts with honesty, and it starts also with being vulnerable and asking others for help. I go back to we're more resilient together. What got me through that was actually my amazing friends at Duke. So I don't know if that answers your question on rebuilding or not.
So this is the first time talking about this in a public or semi-public setting, because it's been a couple of years, but some of you might remember that in 2016, summer of 2016, July of 2016, there was a terrorist attack in Nice, France, where a truck was killing about, I think it was around 20 pedestrians. My dad, who's a journalist, was present at that attack, and he was one of the only journalist who was there that day, and just by coincidence documenting it on video because he was on the balcony of his hotel, which was facing everything. So he was the main news source for a lot of the media outlets worldwide. A week later, there was a active shooter at a shopping mall in Munich, Germany, where I was from, and I happened to be present at that shooting, or I got lucky. Had I gone home from work 30 minutes later that day, I might not be sitting here today. There was about 15 teenagers killed that day. And that day, I was recording the people running away from the shopping mall, and I put it on Twitter. At that time, I still thought I was going to be in journalism. I'd been a radio reporter for a couple of years back home. And well, as you can imagine, a lot of news outlets started reaching out to me, and they played my video material. I was interviewed by, the B.B.Cs and CNNs of the world. And once people started putting the connection of my dad being in Nice a week before me together, there's people coming up with these really, really nasty conspiracy theories. To this day, there is really nasty stuff about me and my family out there. I've received countless death threats, people posting pictures of ammunition on Facebook, tagging me in it, and that was a low in my life where I don't think I necessarily made a mistake, but that, to your point of social media, I stopped being active on social after that event. I stopped putting any tweets out there. My Twitter has been dormant. I refuse to go back on Twitter because of that. And for the longest time, I didn't really know it was possible for me and my personal brand to survive, and me being able to reclaim my own narrative. And it took a couple of years for me to regain the emotional strength to put myself out there in a public, visible way. And now that 7 years later, almost 7 years later, I'm at a point where I feel comfortable posting. There is these awful people are luckily not very active on LinkedIn or the other social media space that I operate in, but it was a big learning experience. I think that hate speech, and especially hate speech towards women online, is one of the biggest crises we're facing as a society these days. It's really, really nasty. So sometimes it's also important to just give yourself some grace, because at the end of the day, you're a human being, right? You're bound to make mistakes, and you'll learn from them, and hopefully you'll come back stronger. I can say, based on that experience, even though it wasn't pretty, and there are still times where I'm oh my goodness, I wish I hadn't pressed the post button that day. But I'm very proud of how far I've come and how much I've grown because of that experience. Any other questions?
So in regard to social media, how much help do the two of you have to maintain your brand?
I do everything by myself.
I do everything myself. That's why you haven't seen me post anything, maybe once. It's easier to go there and like other people's posts, but I haven't posted any. No, I posted something yesterday, but it takes a lot of effort. Now, there's others who have others who can help them do it. I'm very controlling my own narrative, and I have a particular voice and a particular way of doing it, and so it's hard to find someone who can help replicate that, and so I do it myself. You too, right?
Yeah, I do everything by myself. I wish I had help sometimes, especially, creating reels on Instagram or TikTok, that's just, it takes a lot of effort. That's why, similar to Sanyin, I am primarily focused on LinkedIn. I prefer the writing where I don't have to feel the pressure. Oh, now I have to put on a lot of makeup, fix my hair and whatnot, so I can look presentable in front of, a camera, right? And I've also come to realize personally, for me, the audience on LinkedIn is just a lot more, well, first of all, it's more intellectual, as you would probably expect, right? But also more supportive. There's not as many nasty comments. There's still stupid men commenting sometimes, right? They're everywhere, so I can't really avoid that. But yes, to answer your question, I do everything by myself, and I think it's totally fine when you have help, but I think it's important for you to maintain your authenticity, and that's usually easiest when you're the one writing it. Now, from an operational point of view, when you schedule the posts or, that, you can probably outsource, or graphics, but I think the voice needs to be you.
All right. Thank you so much, Sanyin and Tamina, for the session this afternoon.